So with me today is Andrew Clark, a very distinguished well-being researcher. Andrew, I wonder if you could tell us your current title and affiliation.
Now that's more difficult than you might think. So, I'm Research Professor of Economics paid for by the CNRS at what we currently call the Paris School of Economics.
And can you tell us what you feel have been your major contributions to the field of well-being?
I suppose what I would be known for in my discipline, I'm an economist, would be being one of the very first economists of the past two or three decades to have actually used that term, at least in terms of taking survey data on various measures of subjective well-being and applying them to kind of standard economic problems. If I can give you an example, the first ever paper we published in Econ on this with my co-author Andrew Oswald was on unemployment and subjective well-being using British survey data, large-scale survey data, where we came to what many people might think of as being the incredibly unsurprising conclusion that the unemployed were actually unhappy compared to people who had jobs who were otherwise similar to them. And this was, you might think of this as being banal. We have many theories in economics of why people might choose unemployment. And therefore you would not expect them to be, in that sense, any less well off subjectively. But so what looks like a very banal contribution from the outside was thought of as being quite radical in the profession, not only because we never used subjective well-being data before, not really very much at least, but also because we could use it in a way that actually shed some light on what you might think of as being one of the central problems in labour economics. Is unemployment voluntary or involuntary? And of course we believe that it's mostly involuntary now.
Well, that's a great contribution to bring well-being into the field of economics and the study of unemployment. Are there other contributions or research programs you'd like to highlight that you're proud of?
Well, I certainly must be the person who's had the most difficult seminars in economics over the 1990s, taking these kinds of papers on the road to what were quite conservative economics departments across the UK and abroad, and just getting absolutely slammed. Including on one memorable occasion being told to take my seminar presentation and get out and go to the psychologist. Because that's all you are. You know? So damning with faint praise. So no, there was that, but also.
But that's a big deal. So you've actually taken some flack, and you've been. I don't know if I want to say ostracized, maybe, but was that too strong a word by some of your colleagues, or criticized severely?
No. I think it's quite mild. Actually.
Okay.
No, it was a difficult birth in that sense. People just in econ, we just were not used to listening to what people said. Much more interested in what they actually did. So this is the basis of what we call revealed preference theory. If you want to know what you like, let's look and see what you do. Then we can infer what you value. We certainly wouldn't ask you, well, how happy are you now that you're sitting in this nice suite here in Philadelphia, and then make any kind of judgment from that kind of.
So it's very behavioral, but in many cases, I'm thinking of Ed Diener, who was denied a promotion for studying subjective well-being, albeit in a psychology department. But many of these well-being researchers have the last laugh. Have there been some inroads made in economics now, where this is not more accepted?
There's been progress made, that's for sure, and I absolutely wouldn't want to push the idea that happiness data or happiness research is in any way superior to the other established methods we have in econ. I just don't think that's true necessarily. But I think it has been accepted as an approach that can be taken seriously as can theory be, as can experimental, as can randomized control trials, as can other kind of survey-based or natural experiment-based methods. And to the extent that I've seen some really fantastic happiness papers in economics, a whole bunch of really good serviceable ones, and then just the same kind of percentage of total rubbish that you get in any other any other domain.
A mixed
of
bag.
econ. So yeah, it's matured into something coming on for a normal part. I mean, it's still on the way, but it's certainly much more accepted now. Absolutely, our top journals, almost all of them, will regularly publish papers that are to some extent based on self-report subjective data.
Very good.
And yes, that has been just a real sea change.
And you help to bring that about to an extent.
Well, inadvertently, you cast yourself up as the leader, leading from the front, holding the flag.
Okay.
It's just historical accident. The way I got into this, actually, was because I did my PhD on trade unions, trade union bargaining theory, Nash bargaining theory, at the LSE in the mid-80s, with my supervisor, Andrew Oswald, who was also a trade union labour economist. And one of the aspects that we read about and saw in union bargaining documents was this idea that there should be pay differentials. So the union's bargaining aim was not to have $35 a week or whatever it was at those times, but to have $35 a week and make sure that there was a differential of $3 compared to some other trade or some other occupation. So this idea that relative income mattered, not only how much you got, but some kind of hierarchy. You can think of this as a contextual effect,
Yes.
as you see in sociology. So that our breakthrough, or our idea, as it were, was to use data from a very new survey at the time, in the early 90s now, when we came back from the States, Andrew Oswald and myself, the British Household Panel Survey, to look at job satisfaction scores and see whether they were indeed negatively correlated with the incomes that other people earned. So it's just a very simple idea. Let's take some self-report of 5,000 British workers and see whether indeed not only how many pounds they have, but also how many pounds they have relative to other people matters. And it seemed like a satisfaction score was an obvious way of looking for a value of that. And that was the first paper we ever wrote that I like to think of as really quite innovative and a breakthrough.
Yeah.
And one way we can tell that was that it was repeatedly rejected by all of the top journals. And absolutely no one wanted to publish it. And we wrote it in 91, we started writing it in 1991, when I went to Essex, coming back from Dartmouth. And it was published 5 years later.
Wow.
And it just took us that long to beat our heads against the wall. And it was a learning curve, in a way, on both sides. Economics journals weren't used to seeing that kind of data necessarily, and we just did not know how to write a paper with these data either.
Yeah.
But we persevered, and we were very grateful to the journal editor who was gracious enough to work with us on that, to eventually get to a publishable
support you in your trailblazing. Not all of them are willing to do that.
Not that we knew that, of course, and not that he necessarily knew that, but was Catholic enough with a small c to be open to taking new approaches to what looked like interesting, broad questions in the social sciences. So we were lucky eventually to get through with that, and it's now probably my most cited piece. But
so
I was
going to ask if it's well cited. That's another sign of
really done.
Eventual, except very, very impressive.
It's really done very well. But to imagine that I would have predicted that.
You never know, do you? What's going to pan out?
Absolutely not. No, I'd started 3 other research projects beforehand, one of which had done something and then dropped off, another which crashed out in flames entirely.
Yes.
You just don't know. That's part of what research is about.
That's right, very much so. Are there other Any other programs of research or findings you'd like to highlight that you're proud of in your work?
Well, one of the developments of this idea of comparisons of me to you and you to me, and a kind of natural development of that, but this time which came a little bit more from psychology than sociology, was the idea of comparing not to others but to yourself in the past. So, do I think I've got a good salary now? Yeah, sure, because it's 10% better than I earned last year.
Yeah.
And equally, do I think I've got a good salary now? No, because it's less than I earned last year. But those could be the same salaries we're talking about.
Yes.
It's not only where you are, it's how you got there. So this idea of time and comparison to yourself in the past, which we in economics would call habituation or adaptation. Now that's something that psychologists were very interested in, and a chance encounter with actually Joe Sergi in 1996 at the MIQOLS Zero conference in Prince George, where I was having some animated discussion with him about how one should run regressions. And Ed Diener barged in and told me that, oh, you economists, you think you know everything. And so anyway, we had this big three-way sort of shouting match in the canteen at Prince George, and became firm friends. And to the extent that I started working with Ed on this idea of adaptation. I brought in Rich Lucas, who was a new PhD of Ed's at the time, in the late 90s.
Researcher,
Yeah, very, very good. And a co-author of mine, Yanis Georgelis. We eventually managed to mould a research question in our head. But it was a within-subject analysis of adaptation to, firstly, marital status, and then to unemployment. And these are not only fun questions to talk about, they're also absolutely essential in terms of public policy.
Yes.
If unemployment is associated with a sharp drop and then you bounce back up again, in some hedonic utilitarian sense, it doesn't matter very much because you get used to it and you actually feel okay. If you go down and stay down, then it's just a permanent problem, both morally, if you like, and hedonically in terms of the feelings of people who are undergoing it. So it's useful to establish that kind of correlation.
What did you find?
Well, we found that marriage has this fantastic boost, but mostly before it happens. So people who are going to get married are happier. Then they get married and they go back down to the happiness level they had when they were single. And in some cases actually are less happy married than they were being single before being married. So there does not seem to be much hedonic boost from marriage. And in fact, in cross-section, it's very easy to see that most married people are happier than most single people. But that's what we call a selection effect that is almost totally driven by happy people who are naturally happy, being more likely to get married in the first place.
I see.
So we have a standard selection into marriage that's
very interesting.
Biasing cross-section results. With respect to unemployment, and this is absolutely critical, I think, people go down and they just stay there. Go down, they stay rooted there. Obviously that's not true for everybody, but the average effect looks like that. So there's no adaptation to unemployment. Now this was a hitherto sort of unknown collective of researchers, 2 economists, 2 psychologists. I do not believe that we have ever all met, or indeed been in the same country together at the same time.
Amazing.
Oh, it's a very funny experience. But we got 2 nice publications in psychology journals using hierarchical linear modelling, which of course is absolute anathema to economists. We just don't do this.
Okay. It's a very popular technique in psychology.
It's funny, isn't it? It's funny how these techniques get stuck in different disciplines. And if you think about it in a stats way, often the techniques are doing something very similar across the disciplines, but we do it in with a different approach. So I wouldn't do that as an economist, and it sort of rubbed me up a little bit the wrong way, to the extent I thought, let me do it the way I want to do it. And we wrote a 3rd paper in the series, this time looking at 6 different life events: marriage, divorce, widowhood, job quitting, unemployment, and birth of child. And I did it with a within subject analysis with a fixed effect in a dynamic model, which is what I would do as an economist, and found a very nice set of results. And we got it into this time a very well-respected econ journal. So this is this sort of unusual constellation of a mixed discipline a group of people being able to get papers into both psych and in econ. And Ed Diener says it's because Ed knows how to write psychobabble, whereas I can do econ jargon. So that was the way we managed to split up our competences.
Well, it's a wonderful thing to see that. I think that's another contribution, is the interdisciplinary nature of your research.
Again, it's not by design, it's just by accident and the nature of the questions we're asking. And the new availability, we shouldn't underestimate that, the new availability of very large-scale, long-run panel data sets, which were not that well known in psych at the time. And I certainly remember talking to Ed about this in the late 90s, about 97, 98, and he said, I just did not know such resources existed.
Amazing.
Tell me more, tell me more.
Amazing.
10, 15, 20,000 people, standardised, harmonised questionnaire repeated every year. We do not have that kind of size of resource in psych. Of course they have...
How many countries are we talking about that do this?
One.
Okay.
Single country.
Okay.
No, don't do cross-country stuff. There's...
Well, I meant which countries are doing this kind of...
Oh, sorry, which countries are doing it? The longest-running one is Germany with a socio-economic panel. I started working with the British Household Panel Survey in 91. That's now 22 years old. The Swiss have a household panel that's over 10 years old. Ditto the Australians, about 12 years old now. So these are, in a way, it's a shame because in economics, using this long-run panel data, we now know a very great deal about what middle-aged Germans do, which is good, but it's kind of not as broad as we'd really like.
Are there other contributions you'd like to highlight of your work that you're proud of, or?
I think the broadest ones are in terms of social comparison, adaptation, and as I say, just the purely accidental interdisciplinary nature of the work that I do.
Any other practical applications of your work that you'd like to share?
Well, practical in a policy sense,
sure.
Economics, we're terribly modest, well, some of us are anyway, and we don't like to pretend that we have the answer to everything, but I do believe this development of actually taking the hedonic side into account is going to prove to be probably not the central, but one of the key parts of the evaluation of policies in the future. And policy to date has been a purely what we call outcome-based. We're going to see if a policy to help the unemployed has worked in the sense of how many of them are in employment as opposed to how many of them aren't, and if they're in employment, how much have they earned. So it's outcome-based in that sense, but we don't know what people feel about that. And of course, it's arguable whether we should actually do policy based on how good you feel. That raises all kinds of issues about, should I just give you a happiness pill? Should I just zap you so you feel good? Is that okay? But even taking that into account, we have just said, oh, more income is good, or any job is better than unemployment. And we don't know that. That's a dictatorial stance that's coming from the top, saying, actually, we know better than you, and we think this is good. And so we're going to impose our view on you. What I hope is going to happen, at least partly, is that we're also going to allow a bottom-up evaluation of poverty and policy, and let the people who are concerned talk themselves and say, yes, I think this is better, or I'm feeling at this level of stress now, and this level of happiness, this level of enjoyment, and beforehand this is what I reported, and we can take those pieces of information and use those to make hedonic statements about how well our policy is working.
So you're thinking about future research. You're not ready to recommend policies right now, but you've got a methodology for looking at different types of employment and that could or could not be provided.
Almost everything. People who say we don't make decisions, we don't make policy decisions based on some criteria, are just talking out of their hat. We always do. We always do it. We just have to decide which criteria we take into account, and maybe the hedonics should be one of them. In a way, I'm lining up with Danny Kahneman. I had again a great conversation with Ed when we were on the United Nations panel some years ago. Who said that Danny thinks everything's 200 years too early, 200 years too soon, and it always will be. So he's very reticent to take his science, of course he's an absolute genius, and say, oh yes, we should do this, or no, we should do this. Okay. But at the very least, you can make that technique, make that whole avenue of analysis open to the knowledge of people who are making those decisions.
Very good. Can you say what you think the field needs to stay vibrant and growing? That is well-being research in general, the interdisciplinary exercise in general, and perhaps in economics as well?
Oh, that's one of the most difficult questions I've ever had. I'm not French, but I live in France. The French approach would be very Napoleonic and, in a sense, deem that it happened from above. So perhaps create a campus where you would put social science disciplines in close proximity. And of course that can work. I think of Nuffield College in Oxford, for example. It can work, or it can indeed not work at all. I do believe this has to be, in a sense, a bottom-up, embryonic, and you just realise you're working on the same questions as some other people, and then get together with them in a natural way, not in a way that's dictated from above. I'm thinking of the work on institutions and the endogenous emergence of different institutions that's brought economics and political science, for example, extremely close together in some branches of those disciplines over, say, the past 15 years. That's been fantastic. Economists and psychologists are now, to some extent, really quite close.
Are there comparable institutions or meetings like that in well-being?
In a way, I don't know if you need them.
Okay.
Do you actually need them, or should they be just, again, a part of the things that we do as social science researchers? I've often been a little ambivalent about making a journal that's about well-being, because there's always a danger you're going to ghettoise it and put it into a corner and say, oh, I've got a happiness paper, I'll send it to the happiness journal. Why? Why not have a happiness paper and send it to psychological science? Send it to the American Journal of Sociology. Why should you want to put it into a box like that?
Is there anything we can do to facilitate awareness of people's work in different disciplines that's well-being related?
I don't know. As researchers, we're fantastically poor communicators, even to each other. But we're certainly not good at talking to the press in a way that would be able to jump over any kind of interdisciplinary divide. So I don't know what we could do to encourage that, really, Mike. I can't really think how to do that other than carry on doing the good things we are doing. And in a way, research is quite Darwinian. If it's good, it's going to somehow happen.
And it seems like these meetings are what brought you together with people in disparate fields.
Well, yeah, crikey. Well, I went to Prince George for, this was ISQUAL 0, in '96 for a reason I just cannot remember. I think it must have been because Ruth Venhoven was there. And I knew Ruth from beforehand when I'd been in touch with him about the World Database of Happiness. But I certainly didn't know anyone there other than Ruth. And I was most distressed to find I was the only economist. So, to an extent, these interdisciplinary meetings were great, but I was in a bit of a minority in my discipline. So no, the MIQOLS meetings and these kinds of meetings, as we have now and as we have a lot, are great. But in a way, I wonder how the causality works. Are these meetings so great because we're doing work that appeals across the disciplines, or are we doing that work because we had these meetings?
Okay.
I've got a sneaking suspicion it's actually the first of those. So it's the sort of symbiosis that creates this fantastic places to meet and talk. And if I only knew how to create that symbiosis, I would probably be a richer man than I am now.
Well, thank you so much for your contribution to the field.
Hey, thanks very much, Mike.